Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Schaefer. I work with the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities and the MUI Registry Unit. I'm a state investigator. Thanks for coming to Supporting People with Developmental Disabilities and the Criminal Justice System training. This is a really important training for us. The state, the county boards, the agencies who serve individuals with developmental disabilities often have issues which involve the criminal justice system and the people that we serve. Personally, there have been many times over the years that as an investigator, I have been frustrated by the lack of preparedness that DD agencies have and teams have when supporting, advocating, and facilitating services to individuals who are facing criminal charges, incarceration, competency testing, etc. A similar circumstance occurred last year when I was investigating a case involving a young person who was facing serious crime. And his family and him, they both needed support and advice specific to his diagnoses and ensuring that he received appropriate services and advice so that he understood the charges, the criminal justice system process, his rights, his options, and possible outcomes. I was trying to figure out who in our system was responsible to ensure that he had these services, and then what would be in place for this person on the other side of whatever outcome criminally that he faced. I wondered who should be working with the family, the police, the court system, the jail, the attorneys, the psychologist who was doing the competency testing, who was responsible to provide needed documentation and information about this person so that they received good services and that their rights were being taken into consideration. I reached out to several agencies that we are all very familiar with and work with for over the years. Agencies that focus on support, advocacy, legal representation, etc. But I really wasn't getting anything that was beneficial to this person and this person's family. And the family continued to call me for help and advice. So I ended up talking to Connie McLaughlin, who's a supervisor in the MUI Registry Unit, and she suggested that I call Missy Kuhn, who is the Behavior Health Forensic Liaison Supervisor with the Cuyahoga County Board. So I called her and she responded immediately, and she provided me with invaluable guidance and resources to help navigate the criminal justice system on behalf of people who have developmental disabilities and what specific services were in place for them. She also talked about the process that the Cuyahoga County Board has in place to support individuals, their teams, the families, and other agencies when a person is involved in the criminal justice system. I was so impressed and I was so thankful and grateful for this information and to be able to pass this on to this family. And I thought to myself, I think this information should be available and would benefit other agencies throughout the state of Ohio. So I talked to Missy about it and Connie, and they agreed that this would be a great training. Missy suggested that we also include David Nodge, who is the community liaison for the Cuyahoga County Board, and he provides outreach services to individuals, families, teams, outside agencies and services. He helps coordinate, facilitate prevention, training, and other services in the community. So they got together and they came up with this amazing presentation. And so I'm really excited to introduce Missy and David to you to get started. But first of all, Connie McLaughlin has some quick housekeeping information to give you all. And thank you all very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Anna. And like Anna said, we're so excited that everyone's here and grateful for Missy and David for sharing their knowledge with all of us. To go over a couple of housekeeping items, we want to make sure that you have handouts for today's presentation. If you go to the handout section of the GoToWebinar, you'll find not only training information, which outlines what I'm talking about today in terms of housekeeping items. It also has a copy of today's presentations and a group attendance sheet, which we'll talk about in a second. We know that there's a lot of content, and obviously this is quite a long presentation for a webinar. So what we have done, and we're thrilled to say that David and Missy have agreed to do a question and answer session for us following this webinar on January 28th from 11 to noon. So the information that you received, there's a link to register for the question and answer session. So David and Missy are going to go through their presentation. Please feel free to put any questions in the question box. We will record those questions and make sure they get addressed through the presentation, or we will include them in our Q&A session on January 28th. Even if there's questions that you can't think of today and you want to attend this Q&A session, please come prepared with any questions that you might have or requests for additional resources. We are certainly here to provide some additional support and make sure you get your questions answered. 3 hours is a long time, obviously, and so we want you to take care of yourself during this webinar. If you need to get up, take a quick break to grab a cup of coffee or answer a phone call, please do that. When you're able to, please rejoin us and get started, but we want everyone to take care of themselves. We are pleased to say that this webinar has been approved for 3 hours of continuing development hours. That will be awarded for IAs, SSAs, superintendent, business managers, and board members. Anyone that actively participates in this webinar on the 12th of January today will get a certificate emailed to you within 30 days of the webinar. We know everyone's excited to get their certificate, so if you haven't received it within 30 days, please feel free to reach out to us. The last couple of things I want to talk about is just the webinar system. If you are having difficulty hearing, a lot of times it's best to log off the system and log back on, and that usually resolves any sound issues. If you are calling in and also on your computer, you have to be logged onto your computer to get credit. You'll want to mute one of your speakers so you do not have that background noise. If you are attending in a group, say there's 5 SSAs or 5 provider staff that are watching this together, please feel free to fill out a group attendance sheet. The information is included in the training information sheet in the handout section. If you have any questions during this webinar, please feel free to call our office at 614-995-3810. And again, thank you for attending. I'm going to turn it over to Missy to start her presentation.
Thank you so much, Connie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Missy Kuhn. I'm one of the supervisors in the Behavioral Health Department, and I also supervise our Forensic Liaison team here at Cuyahoga DD. Also joining me is David Nodge, who is our MUI Community Liaison, who will be speaking kind of at our second portion of today's training. So thank you all for joining us for this training regarding supporting individuals with developmental disabilities in the criminal justice system. I also want to start with thanking Connie and Anna and DODD for hosting and facilitating this training. As Anna spoke, we talked many, many months ago, and I must say that I never would have imagined that this would have developed into something so big. We have over 600 people that have registered for this training, which I think really speaks to the need and the interest. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We have a lot of information that we're going to be covering. So we're covering a variety of topics. So a lot of this will be brief overviews of things because, you know, for example, Dave could do a full day presentation alone on his role as the MUI Community Liaison. So kind of have a jam-packed training today. And so we encourage everyone really to reach out with their questions as we move through the presentation. Some hopefully will be answered throughout, and if not, again, we have that Q&A session. Okay, so today on the agenda, this is going to be broken down into 3 parts. So the first half, we're going to discuss individuals involved in the criminal justice system and why there is a need for the support. We're also going to have a brief overview of the criminal justice system, as well as the MHDD court that we have here in Cuyahoga County. We're going to have an overview of Cuyahoga DD's forensic unit, as well as David's role of MUI Community Liaison. And in those roles, what is the history and what do we do? We're going to end with talking about assessments, the impact on service planning, ISP development, and where do we go from here in terms of collaboration, training, and advocacy. We're also going to end with some resources that are attached and included in this PowerPoint. You see an asterisk here at the bottom. There are sources that are cited throughout this presentation, so I promise I did not, David and I did not just make this information up, and references are available for anyone that's interested in that. So the first question, why the need? It is a very common question for people, not only in the field, but also that don't work in the field. You know, the thought that people with developmental disabilities actually get arrested, charged, and go to prison or jail. And the answer is yes. I had a training once for new staff, and someone had raised their hand and asked, you know, but not serious crimes, right? And no, yes, in fact, serious crimes as well, kind of have Anna had alluded to early. And so we work with people that are involved in the criminal justice system across the spectrum of charges. So we've worked with people that have been charged with murder or rape, felonious assault, you know, tier 3 sex offenders, as well as, you know, all the way to the end of, you know, lower level misdemeanors. And so not only are individuals with DD involved in the criminal justice system, but studies have shown that they're actually overrepresented in all areas. They're also at increased risk of entering the criminal justice system. Studies have indicated that between 4 and 10% of people in prison have an intellectual disability. Just some statistics, in 2011 and 12, the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 32% of state and federal prisoners reported having at least one disability. 40% of local inmates reported having at least one disability, of local jail inmates. And the most common disability reported was cognitive. So if we think about our work in supporting individuals with disabilities, and let's just look at cognitive disabilities and the impairments that are associated with someone that has a cognitive disability. So we're going to see those limitations and impairments in adaptive functioning, in reasoning, in judgment, in their comprehension. And so how do these impairments impact someone's successful rehabilitation while they're incarcerated? It's important to remember that, you know, in Ohio, it's the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. So there is this underlying goal that when someone is incarcerated, it is not only for the purpose of corrections and punitive regarding what they had done, but also to be rehabilitated, and that the thought that people are being released somehow better. And so if we think about kind of the impairments, just looking again at cognitive disabilities, and we think about the rehabbing programs that are in incarceration settings, you know, you have to think about the impact that is having on our individuals. So risk factors for individuals with developmental disabilities. And I want to start with saying there is no correlation that just because someone has an intellectual disability, that they are more, that there's a higher correlation of being involved in terms of criminogenic tendencies. So that there's a link that because you have an intellectual disability or a developmental disability, that you're at increased risk of being aggressive or committing crimes. So I just want to be clear with that from the beginning. However, there are unique vulnerabilities that present themselves for the individuals that we work with and support that have DD that make them at increased risk for this involvement. And so to start, I just want to mention about the increased risk of victimization. Most of us are, this is not new information for probably any of us. The individuals we support are at increased risk of crime, abuse, neglect, exploitation. Just some numbers here regarding really the startling rate of increase if you have a developmental disability for violent and serious violent crime. And so if we looked at that increased victimization through a trauma-informed care framework, I think it's important, kind of a general assumption that if you've been a victim of crime or been abused and neglected, especially in cases where there's been chronic and complex abuse, we know that there are significant impacts on potentially a person's brain, potentially impacting their mental health. And so are we seeing at times when there is an engagement in potentially a crime or criminal activity that this is a trauma response in terms of fight or flight versus something that is criminal intent. And so someone is perceiving a threat in their environment and is responding potentially with aggression and fighting to protect themselves. We also need to think about the impact of dual diagnoses. Many of our individuals, for a variety of reasons, also have significant mental health issues. And so looking at some of those factors regarding the crime, and are there underlying mental health diagnoses and symptomology that is the result of the actions and the behavior that we're seeing coupled with trauma compared to a true criminal intent and criminogenic factors. So one example of this that I'd like to share is a young woman, we'll just call her Jay, that I had worked with. Jay has an intellectual disability. She also has significant history of trauma, as well as significant mental health diagnoses. She has been involved in the criminal justice system for a variety of different reasons. One of the issues, she was 9 months pregnant. She was not on her medication. She was having a true mental health crisis, was becoming very explosive and violent at home. She actually called the police herself, saying that she was in a mental health crisis. By the time the police arrived, there really was no way to calm her down. She, at that point, was so escalated. And so she ended up fighting the police. And so things clearly continued to escalate. She was arrested. She ended up going into labor, ended up having her child, and was, after giving birth, so immediately didn't even go to jail, but went immediately to the hospital. And was then handcuffed, to the bed after giving birth to her child. And were her actions criminal in nature? Yes. I mean, she assaulted people. She assaulted police. She was assaulting her family. But I think it's really important to put it in context when we're looking at the situation and the fact that this was a young woman who was off her medication, who was experiencing a significant mental health crisis, and as well as in that fight or flight due to her trauma history. And so it kind of begs the question for me of, yes, we know a crime has been committed. However, putting into context and looking at the situation, is jail or is incarceration the answer? Or is giving Jay that treatment that she desperately needs to make her more successful and kind of triaging that in a different direction going to be more beneficial, not just for Jay, but for the community as a whole? Another risk factor is mislabeling, developmental diagnosis as a child. So we think about, there are studies that demonstrate that young children, especially young boys who are African American, that oftentimes struggles in school are looked at as a behavioral problem compared to having testing done to see, really this is more about a learning disorder or sensory issues or an issue with their processing. It is labeled a behavior problem, and we see more punitive consequences, which then leads to increased risks of suspension, detention, direct correlation to lower graduation rates. And if anyone has heard kind of the research that's being done on the school to prison pipeline, the correlation that children that are having very poor educational outcomes and are often not graduating are linked to having earlier involvement in the criminal justice system. There is also the impact of poverty, which that could be a training far longer than a day in and of itself. So there's just a few things I want to highlight regarding this. When we think about the individuals we support, many are on a very fixed income. So many are simply supported by only their Social Security. They may have a vocab program, some may be competitive employed, but oftentimes their income is very small. And so oftentimes I've been involved in planning where an individual may get, a spending allowance of maybe $5 or $10 a week or even a month. And so we think about the process of someone being charged or arrested and their ability to post bond, their ability to afford and access quality representation is all impacted by their finances. There's also that impact regarding poverty if in terms of access to resources. So moving on, there's also a perceived lack of credibility for some of our individuals with DD. They can be perceived as easy targets. So an individual really wanting to be accepted by their peer group. And so they may be manipulated, coerced, they may take the blame for something that they didn't do. They may be involved in things that at the time they don't even realize are actually crimes. Another issue is individuals not understanding their rights during the arrest or legal proceedings. So individuals waiving their Miranda rights because they don't understand what they are. Also the issue of false confessions. So imagining an individual who's in an interrogation room alone with a detective who's been asked the same question 20 times and has consistently said no. And so finally says yes, because the thought is maybe I'll get to go home. Maybe I'll be done with this interview. There's also the issue of individuals trying to hide their DD diagnosis as a form of protection. They don't want to appear more vulnerable. So people not being flagged early on with having a disability because they maybe appear street smart, maybe they have strong expressive language, but really they can't read or they can't write, or their processing and comprehension is very limited. So to come full circle, I think to give a good example regarding the risk factors is if at any point for the majority of us, if we were charged with a crime right now, most of us would have the ability to read, to write, to understand the charges against us, to be able to understand the process, although it can be very complicated, but learn about the process, be able to know what our rights are, be able to navigate our bail or our bond. Most likely we'd be able to hire our own attorney to navigate this system. And you think about the majority of the individuals with DD through this process that are not able to do many of those things. And so that speaks to the need for supports. So the impact of deinstitutionalization. So the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, this act had actually really great intentions, was forward thinking. At the time, they were seeing really deplorable conditions in many of the state's institutions that not only housed individuals with significant mental health, but also people with developmental disabilities, people with profound ID, individuals that had Down syndrome, individuals that had brain injuries. And so there was this push to really shift the focus of people being institutionalized and move out into the community with those wraparound supports. So there was a focus on developing community treatment centers, closing state hospitals. And so although the mission of this and the spirit of this was one that was extremely positive, unfortunately, in hindsight, there was tremendous gaps in services. And so, for example, the goal was to have 1,500 to 2,500 community centers where people transitioning would have the very necessary treatment for their mental health. And less than half of those actually were developed. So we are now seeing people that are released into the community that have been institutionalized for many, many, many years that are now homeless, are not receiving needed mental health treatment. Many did not have natural supports or family because they had been institutionalized for so long. And we were seeing a great increase of these individuals getting involved in the criminal justice system. So once incarcerated, I think it's really important to note that the vast majority of individuals that are currently incarcerated will be released. So studies say about 95%, currently 95% of people that are incarcerated eventually will be returning to our communities, in our communities. And so the general assumption is that, well, people released and returning to the community are rehabilitated, correct, right? They've done their time, they've served their time, they're rehabilitated back into the community and are somehow more safe. And so, unfortunately, studies have also indicated that individuals with DD, often while they're incarcerated, lack the needed accommodations. They're also at increased risk of the use of solitary confinement and chemical restraint. And something that's interesting is the use of confinement and segregation is at the discretion of the facility. That is not something that goes through the court process. That is not something that a judge has oversight on. That is exclusive to the decision of the facility where someone is placed. And so for individuals with DD, they may be placed in segregation for their own protection, because we also know that they're at increased risk of being victimized by inmates because they're more vulnerable. They also may be placed in segregation. Oftentimes people are placed in segregation in institutions because they're breaking the rules. They're not following the rules. You know, prison is a very controlled, rule-following system. And so if you think about some of our individuals who may not have the capacity to follow the rules because of the impairments that they have, and so they're being put in confinement or segregation because of those impairments and inability to follow the rules in place. Oftentimes, if there is rehabilitation, although again, we know this is a big push at rehabilitation and corrections, but there are many institutions that don't have adequate rehabilitation programs such as training, vocational training, education, trade. And so if someone is in an institution where there is rehabilitation, oftentimes this is not modified to address the limitations that our individuals have. For example, to address issues with literacy, their cognitive deficits, their hearing and vision impairments, so that they are able to successfully engage and understand the rehab services that are offered. Also, I wanted to mention about the use of solitary confinement. There has been significant research out there that demonstrates the damaging effects of the use of confinement and segregation on human beings and on people that are incarcerated. And so this oftentimes will exacerbate mental health symptoms. And there is also studies out there that suggest that people that are in segregation for extended periods of time actually develop brain changes that have characteristics of an acute organic brain disorder. So people that may go into prison that may have DD, that may not have mental health symptomology, may come out with that because of the use of segregation and solitary confinement while they've been there. So studies have shown that individuals with developmental disabilities served more time, received inadequate rehabilitation, and are also at increased risk of recidivism. So really this is counter to our goal of decreasing recidivism, which is actually the mission in Ohio of our rehab and corrections. It is to reduce recidivism among those that we touch. And so considering these factors and kind of that brief rundown that I gave of the experience of our individuals with DD that are incarcerated, is it reasonable to expect that some of the individuals with DD are released and rehabilitated, or they're actually released and further traumatized? And I think it speaks to the question of, again, 95% of people are going to be released back into our community. Do we want people released better, or do we want people released worse? And if they are coming out worse, how are we truly increasing safety for the community? And are there more appropriate options or for better outcomes for our individuals? And then what's our role and responsibility to the individual and to the community as a whole when we recognize putting all this information together, this clear gap? And so that brings us to Cuyahoga DD and our forensic unit here. This is something that we recognized this gap. And so the focus of our unit is to forward Cuyahoga DD's, our agency mission, which is empowering and supporting individuals to live, learn, work, and play in their community. So our forensic unit is within our Department of Behavioral and Health Supports, and our liaisons assist with individuals with DD who become involved in the criminal justice system and any involvement in the criminal justice system. So how do we do that? So this is kind of a brief overview. I will go into more detail in the third part of the training, but we assist with that early identification in the criminal justice system. So oftentimes we have great cross systems in place to flag individuals that are in jail in terms of a potential DD diagnosis, and they will reach out to one of the liaisons. Oftentimes it is an individual who may not be linked with us, who has no history with us. And so the liaison is kind of that first link to see this is an individual who may benefit and qualify, and gathering that information to see if they're eligible. We also provide consultation throughout the court proceedings. We collaborate with interdisciplinary teams, and that's both internally with our fantastic teams that we have with our SAs, as well as other ancillary departments. We also work with reentry linkage and community-based service. We also facilitate successful outcomes for individuals that are on parole or probation through kind of that additional monitoring and ongoing teamwork along with the parole and probation officer. We identify barriers to success and strategies to mitigate that risk. And we also provide support, advocacy, and outreach. So the history of the forensic services in Cuyahoga County, I am not going to go through this in detail. I just wanted to show this because I think this highlights a few things. One is that it highlights that it started small. So, back in the early 80s, due to the increasing number of individuals in DD that were appearing in our common pleas court, an interdisciplinary team formed. They recognized something was changing. There was a gap in service and linkage, and where do we go from here? So I think that's important to notice that these are things that don't just, come about, that it takes a very long time, that it can start very small with people that are committed, that recognize what the barriers are, and problem solve from there. I think it also highlights the evolution over time. So this is over 40 plus years. We're talking about something that started in the 80s, and we are continuing to evolve. Our systems change, our population changes, policies change, and so we are constantly having to adapt to that. And always the goal is that collaboration to review what the trends and the patterns are, identify the areas of need, and problem solve from there. So specialized courts. In Cuyahoga County, through our common pleas court, we do have a specialized mental health and DD court docket. And so just to give a little background information, because we work very closely with them. So this was started in 2002. The court developed a mental health court docket model to address the need for individuals that were being charged with felonies that had significant mental health diagnoses as well as DD. And so in 2010, the name changed to reflect really the population that it was serving, which wasn't just mental health, but it was also individuals with DD. Our court currently has 5 judges, 2 probation supervisors, 2 pretrial officers, and 13 highly trained post-conviction officers. So it's a collaborative effort between the courts and the community agencies, so not just with Cuyahoga DD, but also a variety of mental health providers to help improve the care for offenders that are involved in the specialized docket while promoting, again, the goal of increased safety for the community through therapeutic approaches and evidence-based practices, oftentimes alternatives, if possible, to incarceration. So the benefits of the MHDD court include that early screening in jail, so linking people early on, identifying if someone is a candidate and eligible for the MHDD docket, as well as potentially eligible for our services or the need to be linked to mental health services. All of the employees with MHDD court also receive specialized training. The goal, again, is to explore diversion options. So what are the alternatives to incarceration? So again, those individuals that potentially are involved in the criminal justice system, potentially untreated mental health symptomology, or attributed to their deficits and limitations with their DD diagnosis or trauma, or a combination of all 3. And so again, is incarceration the answer, or is linking to other treatment going to have better outcomes for the individual as well as the community in terms of safety? They have routine clinical staffings with all of the community providers that are involved. So that includes our team of forensic liaisons as well as mental health treatment providers. They address barriers and provide that very necessary linkage. Housing is always an issue, and I'm sure is probably an issue for no matter what county you live in. I can imagine that being a barrier for the majority of us, as well as alcohol and drug services and employment. And they provide ongoing collaboration with the team. And so there really is this thought of wraparound supports for the individuals that are involved on the specialized docket. So currently our Cuyahoga DD forensic team has a supervisor, myself, as well as 4 full-time forensic liaisons. We are currently working with over 160 individuals, and that is across all cases of the criminal justice system, to things that are very extreme, very serious felony crimes, to misdemeanors, to individuals that are on probation, individuals getting released from prison. So really across that whole spectrum. There are team responsibilities that each of the forensic team has, as well as specialized areas of work. And I think that's important because the specialized areas of work really allows the forensic liaison assigned to develop that important relationship and rapport within that area. So for example, we have one of our liaisons one of their roles is to provide all the services to individuals that are in the Cuyahoga County Jail. We have another one that works with all of our municipal courts. We have another that one of their roles is specialized in connecting people to reentry and tracking individuals as they're being released from prison. So again, they're really able to be more well-known within the specialized area that there are, build those relationships, kind of become the go-to, and so people know who to call when they are in need of assistance. So our unit provides services for individuals that are eligible for Cuyahoga DD or also in the process of establishing eligibility. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes we are that first link in terms of working towards, there's a question of eligibility. They may have not been linked before. And so getting that process started with gathering more information, getting the information to our intake, contacting with a release of information to see if we have preponderance so we can move forward with that eligibility process and get them linked. We also have a contract with the Corrections Planning Board. And so we also provide some services to individuals that are on the MHDD court docket. However, they're not eligible for our services. So for example, individuals that may have a borderline intellectual disability. So they may not qualify, we may not have the preponderance for them to qualify, or they may not have the 3 functional limitations that are needed in the OEDI, but we still will provide, if they're involved in the MHDD court, we can still provide some level of service coordination to them. We also assist with forensic monitoring, and I will talk more in detail about that, but this is for individuals who have been found incompetent to stand trial, and also not restorable, that are released in the community and or are still at either institutions. And so we can provide assistance with monitoring as well. We have ongoing collaboration, again, with our court, with Warrensville Developmental Center, with North Coast, as well as Elvis House, which is an ICF sex offender treatment residential program in Columbus, Ohio, where some of our individuals receive that intensive service. And again, we also track the release of eligible individuals in prison. So for example, someone that we had been actively working with that gets sentenced to 4 years in prison. Obviously that we're not going to be providing ongoing service coordination for the duration of the 4 years that they're going to be in prison. However, we also want to make sure that it becomes on our radar, about a year or 9 months prior to the release, that we are reaching out to the social worker at the prison and saying this person had been involved prior. Are they interested in being involved again? A lot of times the prison will have no idea that they were linked with us. And so we want to make sure that that connection and that linkage is occurring early on for the purposes of planning, rather than someone is sentenced, is closed, and then is completely off our radar. And the expectation is they contact us if they need our help. We like to be more proactive. So a brief overview of the criminal justice system. So we get involved, at the beginning, you look at the arrest and you look at charges. And so that could be at the felony level, which is common pleas. That could also be at misdemeanor. So those are charges that are filed in municipal courts. Just because someone is charged does not necessarily mean that they have been arrested. Sometimes people are issued a citation and then must appear in court. We also are involved at the entirety of the predisposition phase. So that is really before kind of the end result of the case, if you will. So before the finding of guilty or not guilty. So being involved in if there's a question of competency for the individual or the restoration process. And again, I'll go into more detail about this. Being a part of service coordination, providing education to the team regarding the status of bond or bail, as well as the plea bargaining process. Once someone takes a plea or is found guilty, there's also typically a pre-sentencing investigation or PSI, and that is a gathering of information to provide recommendations. The court personnel do this to provide recommendations to the judge in regards to sentencing. Then there is post-disposition. So this is everything that occurs after there has been a finding or a resolution. Someone has pled guilty to charges, whether they've taken a plea or they've had a trial. And so this is where we look at sentencing or the end result, whether it's prison, probation, parole. Some people it's time served, depending on the amount of time that they've had, in jail. We're also involved in registration requirements. So individuals that are receiving our services that may be actually completely done with their criminal charges, however, are registered sex offenders. And so making sure that the team is aware of what the registration requirements are. And so the last thing we would want is for someone to have further legal sanction if they need assistance with completing registration, and that kind of falls through the cracks. So making sure that it's transparently really put out there in someone's plan and that the expectations are known. So competency evaluations. So the purpose of a competency evaluation is to assess if an individual understands the nature and objective of the legal proceedings and can assist in their own defense. And I just want to be clear, this is very different from someone being found incompetent through probate court and having a guardian. These are two very different evaluations and two processes. So for example, we will hear, well, so-and-so has a guardian, so they can't be found competent to stand trial. And we work with individuals who in fact do have a guardian. They've been found incompetent through probate court. However, they are found competent to stand trial. The competency evaluation in the criminal courts is solely narrowly looking at their ability to understand, again, the nature and objective of what they've been charged in the legal proceedings, and if they can assist in their own defense. There's also individuals who do not have a guardian, who have not been found incompetent, but are found incompetent to stand trial. So I just want to be clear that there is a difference there. And so the competency evaluations, that can be requested if there is ever a concern. That can be requested. The judge can order that. The defense attorney can request that. The prosecutor. Oftentimes, if we're aware of someone getting involved and there is a question of competency from the beginning, that is something that we can bring to the team, that we can discuss with the prosecutor or with the defense attorney and say, hey, this is an individual we've been working with for 4 years. They have an IQ of 50. They have significant impairments here. And so we would highly advocate for a competency evaluation. And then that can be requested by whether it's the prosecutor or the defense attorney. And so these are completed by trained professionals, often a psychiatrist or a psychologist. We work with the Court Psychiatric Clinic here in Cuyahoga. And so following the competency evaluation, there will be one of 3 determinations. And so one is that the person is in fact competent to stand trial. The other is that they're incompetent to stand trial. However, there's a chance that they can be restored to competency. And what that means is that they are currently incompetent. However, with potential treatment and training, they may be able to be restored. The third is they're incompetent to stand trial and they're unrestorable. And so in terms of restoration, that is time limited depending on the nature and severity of the crime itself. So for example, it can be anywhere from 30 days of restoration, which is for lower level misdemeanors, to up to a year, which is for those higher level felony cases. And so if it's deemed that someone is incompetent to stand trial but restorable, their restoration time will depend on what the charge is, as well as will be delivered in the least restrictive environment. So oftentimes, someone may be going to Warrensville Developmental Center for restoration. They may go to, if the primary diagnosis is really a developmental disability and limitations around that. They also may go to North Coast Behavioral Health if again, the primary impairment is related to some significant mental health symptomology, or it may be determined that outpatient restoration is appropriate. And that is something that can be done outside of an institution, that they can be out in the community and receive that restoration from a provider. And I also wanted to add that just because someone has been found, one of these determinations, they've been found competent, they've been found incompetent, there can be new competency evaluations at every case. So we have often seen someone who has a history of maybe 5 cases. Some they've been found competent. In a record review, we're looking at some they've found incompetent. So even though someone has gone through a competency evaluation and something has been determined, but there is a new case 2 years from now, the team can still advocate for another competency evaluation specific to that case. And so just one example of that, I worked with an individual. He was getting released from prison after serving 15 years for a very violent crime. And in looking at his history, he had actually been found incompetent to stand trial and unrestorable twice for 2 different cases, very serious cases. And on that second case, the prosecutor advocated for a second evaluation, competency evaluation. And it was actually overturned, and it was determined that he was restored and was competent to stand trial. And so he was actually re-indicted for that first case. And so they ended up prosecuting both of those serious cases, despite the fact that originally he had been found incompetent and unrestorable on both. So just, again, an example of the changes that can be done. So what happens when an individual is found not competent and not restorable? So it depends on the nature and the severity of the charges. So one of the things that could happen is the charges may be dismissed. Another option would be potentially a civil commitment through probate court for hospitalization or institutionalization. There also can be continued court jurisdiction. Now, these are for the most serious cases. So for violent felony 1 or 2 offenses, so we are talking about murder, attempted murder, rape, aggravated robbery. It's a very high level felonies where an individual has been found not competent, not restorable, but the court has found by clear and convincing evidence that the defendant did in fact commit the offense and is subject to hospitalization or institutionalization due to their significant mental health needs or DD diagnosis. And so the court can have jurisdiction for the time that the person faced in prison. So this can range. So currently we are working with several individuals and we call this ISTU CJ status. So they, again, have been found incompetent, not restorable. They have been, by clear and convincing evidence, it was evidence that they committed the crime. And so they're on court jurisdiction for what they would have served in prison, whether that's 8 years or whether that's life. And so this is an institutionalized level system with an opportunity for eventual conditional release status. So it's 1 through 5 kind of step down level system. And so depending on, the team and the court's decision about, oftentimes people will start at either Warrensville or North Coast. and then may, if they work through the level system, eventually on level 5 can be, as they work through the level system, that has to be approved through the courts. But level 5 would be getting ready for that conditional release. So typically individuals with DD that are on ISTU CJ status require a very high level of supports when they're transitioning back into the community. I mean, if we just think about the fact that they've been found not competent and restorable yet have committed a violent, very serious crime, we would want to make sure for the safety of the individual and the community that whatever the assessed support needs have been identified, that those in fact are in place. And so I just want to give one example of an individual that we are working with that is on ISTU CJ status. We'll call him Frank. Frank was charged with rape and with kidnapping. This occurred in his adult day program, despite the fact that Frank had a pretty significant history of when the opportunity arose to sexually aggress or act out towards others and his peers. And it was very clearly outlined, in his plan, the need for constant supervision, including at all times in the bathroom. Also important to note that Frank has a severe intellectual disability. So when we're looking at intent and understanding the consequences, of what had happened. And so this incident actually occurred at his day program when there was a lapse in the assessed need for supervision when he was alone with a peer in the bathroom. And so he was found to be incompetent, not restorable, and was placed on ISTU CJ status. And he's been released. He was released out into the community after working through his level system. He's been released for 6 years. And knock on wood, Frank is doing fantastic. So really, again, identifying what those supports are and making sure that they're happening upon release. Just kind of in general, I think we probably could all agree that someone that has a severe intellectual disability would not do well in a prison setting for a variety of reasons. And so the fact that, yes, he was institutionalized for some time for safety, worked through the level system, but is now in the community, receiving 24/7 supports in a congregate setting, as well as services through a forensic liaison, SA provider, all of that. I just think is a good example of someone that's on this status. So at what point should the forensic liaisons get involved? What we preach internally is really at any time, no wrong door policy. So as soon as someone finds out that there's a citation or there's an arrest at any stage of the legal proceeding, so including we find out maybe after the fact that someone has been sentenced, someone's actively on probation and we had no idea, we weren't involved in the beginning, we'd rather get involved late than not get involved at all. If we know someone's being released again from jail or prison, obviously if they're on ISTU CJ status, however, oftentimes we are involved very early on in those cases and are involved throughout the process. So of course, early identification is optimal, but again, we'd rather get involved late than not at all. So that early screening for the MHDD court and eligibility and linkage with us really is vital. So that we can be proactive and plan for someone that's getting involved early. So community collaboration. So the importance of training, collaboration, again, early identification and linkage, establishing communication and those relationships within the community, we cannot highlight enough. And I know David is we're at the point where we're going to transition to him. This is my last slide, but so really looking at that engagement and that buy-in, talking with police officers, first responders, the crisis services. Is there a crisis intervention team, in your county? Hospitals and psych services. At the jail, are staff trained in identifying a possible underlying DD or mental health diagnosis? Are there screening procedures in place? And more importantly, number one, that's great if there's screening procedures in place and there's training that's done about identifying a possible DD diagnosis. But equally important is step 2. What's that linkage? So what's then the process kind of cross-system wise to share that so that once someone is screened and identified, we're being linked in, or the mental health provider is being linked in, or they're getting linked into the MHDD court and that track. And Also defense attorneys. So again, not every county has a specialized docket, but if you do, are defense attorneys aware, and do they know how to refer clients for that docket? Reaching out to advocates and social workers that are involved in any aspect of the criminal justice system. So to make sure that we have that established relationship with those community providers for linkage. It's also really important that we identify very clearly how we're going to be sharing information across systems. So it's something that we continue to work on and get better, like I said earlier, as our systems change, as our policies change. So it's very important to stay on top of that so that things aren't getting lost. And so now to our part 2, which is our fantastic David Nodge, who is our MUI Community Liaison, and he is going to tell you about his role and all the fantastic work that he does within our community. So I'm going to play a round robin and switch chairs, and David will be joining us.
Thank you so much, Missy. And I work very closely the MUI Community Liaison position with Missy and her excellent department, and use them as a resource for navigating through the court system, criminal justice system, especially when individuals that I work with are arrested, charged, or incarcerated due to an incident. So talk to you a little bit about our MUI Community Liaison position here at the County Board of Developmental Disabilities. And we was created in 2017 and through Bonnie Demopoulos, who's our current MUI manager. And Bonnie really was looking to create a position that proactively identified needs for community resources prior to the community engagement to decrease the health and safety risk for the individuals. And she really saw this happening firsthand as being an investigative agent in the MUI department and dealing with individuals that had an MUI, and just seeing how there was just a little bit of confusion and a lot of inability for ability for things to get mishandled and quickly go south. And it created a lot of tensions with communities, with community leaders, with our first responders, which are police and fire, and created a lot of tensions. And she felt that if we could get in there prior to and give some information to and create a little bit of a partnership with those first responders and community leaders prior to a critical incident, that things could just go so much better, and we could have just a greater communication and really develop a partnership. So we really are looking to develop and implement strategies to identify health and welfare risks with our Cuyahoga DD staff, our provider staff, our community, and our community agencies. And then we all work together, and then through that we create what are called a address flag, or I'll create an address flag or a special attention, and I'll provide that to our first responders, and then they can use that so when there is a call that they have that information beforehand. So when going into address an event that has occurred with an individual served, that they already have an idea of what to expect and how to best support that individual, keeping not only the individual and the staff or family serving that individual safe, but also themselves as well. Provide education and training to those departments upon request. I always am offering that training with every address flag that I send each department. And a lot of times things are pretty straightforward. And if we do run into some issues, there's always that opportunity for them to call me up and say, hey, Dave, can you come out, and we're having some issues and my officers would like to talk to you about what's going on. So my position has really been identified by our communities. And we have over 60 different communities throughout Cuyahoga County that I deal with as an identified resource for them to call with any questions. I provide them with their education, their training to local law enforcement, safety departments, and DD providers regarding community integration, as well as awareness of individuals with DD, to let them know that how we can successfully support individuals with DD in their community, and even individuals that with significant needs. So how did I get involved in this position? Well, I've been I didn't realize that my 21 years spent in adult services was preparing me for this position. And I draw on all the experiences through those 21 years of working in our adult service program with my 2 years of direct care and 4 years of county board supervision and 4 years as a rehabilitation manager, and winding up prior to this position, my 11 years as a manager of one of our adult activity centers. And part and parcel of all those years was the community involvement and getting individuals involved in the community, being a part of the community, especially when I was a rehabilitation manager, building, partnering with community businesses, was vice president of Chamber of Commerce, so very involved with the government, with the city, within the city that my adult activity center was in, very involved with the mayor, the police, the fire, the police chief, and developed those great relationships, which really assisted me and aided me in reaching out, kind of knowing the ins and outs of community government and police and fire and how those entities operate, and being able to be very effective early off in my role. Throughout my career, I've also been kind of on the forefront of training throughout our county board, creating new programs and being involved in many transitions, and always very active in county board committees and initiating and programs, any new initiatives throughout my 21 years with the county board. So being a part of a brand new program that really just kind of had a framework developed, and it was really my role to establish what that community liaison position would be and to make that successful. And I think the key to the success is being a problem solver and a resource for the community, its leaders, and of course, our first responders as well, that we rely on very much. So how do I get involved? Well, there's no wrong door. And with that being no wrong door to access to me, there's really no wrong question. So I'm going to work for however that contact is made and for whatever that question is to get some type of answer for you, whether I provide you with that answer or connect you with somebody that can provide you with whatever it is to meet that need that you're currently having. My initial contact is made usually through an identified need, and that need could be medical, behavioral. It could be a new community residence going in, and we want to make sure that everybody is aware. And when I say everybody, I'm talking about our community leaders, that they're aware that maybe a new home is going in, so that if they are receiving a call, and many times, councilman is receiving a call or the building department is receiving a call because all of a sudden 4 individuals move into their home and they're supported by 3 staff 24 hours a day. And there's 12 cars going in and out of the driveway every day. So what's everybody think? Oh my God, it's a drug house that I'm living next to. So those community leaders, then the council person is saying somebody's running a business out of their home. This is a residential facility and everything. So if we have that conversation prior to that home opening, we realize that the leaders can answer the questions to their constituents or provide them with my name and number, and I can educate the community on those as well. I've worked very closely with our housing and placement team, and really just with our multi-systems team as well, and getting involved with those individuals that are very high needs, and really bringing in the community, its leaders, and the first responders to work with them, educate them, and really develop that partnership early on. And that is so much the key. A lot of times our ancillary services will get me involved through our OT, speech, behavioral health services, seeing identified needs with individuals, and they will get me involved as well. I'll get calls from families, guardians, caregivers. Just a family will call me and say, hey, we just moved into a new neighborhood. We have our son who's 6 years old. He's autistic. We're not having any issues, but can you help us to reach out to our first responders to let them know that our son lives here? Sometimes he has loud vocalizations at night, which isn't a problem now in the wintertime. Come summer, all of a sudden people are hearing sounds coming out of the house at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and not familiar with the family, and they're calling the police thinking that something's wrong in the house next door. So again, making those initial contacts with the police and providing them with some information. Providers many times will call me directly, and they may be having issues with neighbors and neighbor complaints and things that are just making it uncomfortable for the individuals to live in their community. And so I'll work with the provider and with the community members, maybe reach out to the neighbors and so on, and just to help to educate. And again, it's so much, I think so much value in this position is just to have the ability for somebody to reach out and be heard, whether it's community member or community leader, that they're being heard and that they know that after they present me with whatever issue is occurring, that I'm following back up with them. Here's what we have done, and moving forward, really looking at addressing the issues, and if there are continuing issues, to again make it that I am your contact, I am your resource. Work a lot with our city leaders, our mayor, our building departments, and again, being a constantly evolving position and always learning. I'm learning when we do put those new homes in that I am letting our building department know that those individuals are moving into a new residence there, because again, residents are calling the building department and stating that, somebody's running a business out of their home and they can't do this. So again, providing that education for them to allow that manager of that building department to respond in an educated manner directly, quickly, efficiently, right to that resident, and kind of before things snowball, escalate, and get out of control. And with the first responders, we're talking about our multiple calls that individuals may get out to our first responders. So they're dealing with the same issue, same problem over and over. So working with them, sometimes I'll get that call because there was a change in the individual. They had a medication change, new provider went in, new provider took over, and it all happened very quickly prior to us being able to give that notification out to those first responders. So they're calling me knowing that, hey, call Dave, we're having a little bit of an issue here, and they understand that those issues will get addressed and resolved. So once the need is identified, everything is a person-centered approach. There's no one-size-fits-all, and especially dealing with over 60 different municipalities, it all depends. I couldn't tell you always talk to the chief or always talk to this lieutenant. Depending on the size of departments is really dependent on who to call. A lot of times I'll start off with the website of the police and fire department and see if they have already a system set up for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Many times cities have set something up for individuals with autism, and so that'll give me information on who to contact and where I should go, and is there a form they already have to use to fill out, and so on. So it's educating myself within each of the communities is I find to be very helpful. I meet with our with the individual's team, and whoever is a part of that team and whatever services that they are receiving. I explain my role to them and how we can help, find out what the needs are. We look at and identify and agree to what information is needed to be shared to be most helpful to ensure that health and welfare in the event of need from responders for any needs that they may have. So when that responder comes on scene, what do they need to know to be successful? And it's really providing that information that is just so valuable. And in starting this position and kind of explaining my role to first responders, it was very rewarding because I received nothing but thank you. This information is so valuable. Every time I sent information out, or I would receive a message, boy, I wish you were here 5 years ago when we had this such and such incident going on, that you would have been so helpful in serving that individual. So it's really been a successful role here in Cuyahoga County. Has really proven to be a very demanding role, and I am in constant contact with our communities on just really a daily basis. In working with the team, I become a part of that team, and kind of work with them. And it's valuable because I like to get to know the individual that I'm working with, and really want to, almost to the point of where I could provide services to that individual if requested to step into, and know as much about that individual and become very familiar, so I can speak in an educated manner to those first responders, community leaders, and meet the individual's needs. Again, looking to improve services and ensure that health and welfare. And by staying involved, I find out when a house manager's changing, a new provider is coming on board, there's going to be home modifications going in to address the multiple elopements that the police have been out there for the last 3 or 4 times, and we're putting a fence up and this is what's going on, so that they're aware of what's going on. I had one instance where a home was looking to put a fence up and some high needs individuals, and so I called the police chief, who is just wonderful, and have great relationship with him. And I said, Chief, you know, they're having a little bit of a problem with the building department. Is there anything you can do to assist me with this? 5 minutes later, I received a call from the building manager after I hung up the phone with the chief, and the building manager let me know exactly what was needed, and the situation was resolved in a matter of minutes. But that just kind of speaks to the relationships that we have built, and people really want to support and have great concern and compassion for the work that we do and the individuals that they serve. And they really want to see them having the best services and supports delivered to them. So as far as developing partnerships, it has just been wonderful in that aspect, and meeting the needs of the individuals we serve. Again, the education of the DD delivery system is just so vitally important. And what's the role of my role? And what is the role of the support administrator? What's the role of the county board? What's the role of the provider? When I started this position, everybody was county board staff. So there was the provider at the group home. Everybody would always refer to them, to the providers as your staff. So it was educating communities on what is the whole process and of the DD service delivery system, and how is it delivered? How do we interact with each other? How do we support each other? And, you know, who to go to in identified need. So a lot of times I'll give them the provider information so that the provider can then, again, being that liaison, building those bridges so that provider can develop that relationship with the city leaders, with the first responders. And many times when I do go out and speak with our first responders, I'll bring a manager or a supervisor from a home with me, so that putting a name with the face is just forms such a greater bond and greater relationship. So it is really, again, about building all that relationship. So once we go through and we sit on those team meetings and we gather all that good information for, you know, how best to support that individual, what an officer or first responder may encounter if they're dispatched out. That information that was agreed upon by the team is then provided to the identified first responders department contact. And again, there is, with all the different municipalities, everyone is different. Sometimes I deal with the chief directly, sometimes it's a lieutenant, sometimes it's the chief's administrative assistant. It all depends, but once that relationship is established, they know who to go to, I know who to go to, and many times it's multiple members in that department. So I deal with the primary people that I deal with, but then I'll CC the chiefs or lieutenants also on that information. And what do they do with that information once they receive it? They can distribute it out to their officers so that they have that information. It's also inputted into the computer-aided dispatch system, which every law enforcement entity across the country uses, also called the CAD system. And what that does is creates a special attention or address flag entry. So if somebody's called out to 1100 Smith Road, then that address flag is going to pop up with all that information in there. So that dispatching officer will have that up there. I may go out to the first responders departments for their roll calls for our police and our shift meetings for EMS and fire to provide additional education. And again, it could be education of the DD system, could be education of individuals with DD in general or dual diagnosed individuals, or it could be client specific. Many times it's all three of those in a compact information sharing session. So, 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm doing the morning roll calls, and then I'm back there for the 3 o'clock and then maybe of 11 o'clock roll call as well, hitting all the shifts and making sure that they have the information that they need. And again, I become that single point of contact for the first responders, questions, concerns, follow-up. And with every department being different, sometimes I'll get a call or email directly from an officer. They have my cell phone number, they have my email, my desk phone. So I make myself very accessible to them because I want them to know that we appreciate all the support and their partnership, and I want to support and partner with them as well. So, we go through and it's all about building those successful community relationships. And we want to develop those relationships with the community and the providers through an identified need, preferably prior to a crisis. We all work in this field, so if we all could predict all the crises, we probably wouldn't have our MUI department. To the best of our ability, we try and get in there prior to a crisis, develop that, share that information, bring those first responders and community partners in from the beginning. And it's just such a different atmosphere when there is a crisis, when you've already established that relationship, that people are just looking to work to a solution. The angry calls and, what's going on here, but now it's, Dave, we're having this issue over here. Can you work with us to help resolve this issue? Which, again, work with us. So we're working together, partnering. So developing those relationships with community and providers, you really need to do that through that responsiveness, the follow through, and above all, that follow up. So following up with them, checking in with them, how are things going? And just creating that conversation and keeping that going. So we'll continue that communication with the individual's teams. And again, staying on, being a part of that team, providing updates back to the first responders and community leaders is if necessary. Usually the community leaders, they drop out very quickly once that councilman has rectified we've rectified and worked through the issue. So they're good. So they kind of drop off, but they know I'm there as a resource if they need me. But I'm really dealing very, very closely with the first responders and developing those relationships. And then it's the other half of that is then they send me information, which I relay back to the team. And relaying that information back to the team, many times they're sending me those police reports and I'm providing that to the support administrator or to the leadership of the provider, and they were unaware that the incident had even occurred. So we're having more timely follow-up and addressing situations, and we can address those crisis situations with the team and first responders working together. We provide additional education and training always to our first responders. And many times we're identifying gaps in the plan. And, you know, there's not enough shift on or staff on third shift. So we're having an elopement that's occurring on a frequent and regular basis and putting somebody at risk. So, you know, we're identifying that early on and then bringing in other departments to help us address those needs with the individual. Why are we making all of these notifications? Because we want to begin those conversations early. When cities have the information early, they're so much more likely to be supportive and work with you. Again, when you develop those relationships and the communities and the community leaders know, like, trust you because you have established those lines of communication when a concern arises and have gone through that follow-up and follow-through, and you've created that strong relationship with them. A lot of times I'll get calls from an issue that either police department is dealing with or a fire department is dealing with a member in their community that isn't even served by us, but they just want to bounce some ideas off of me just because of working with so many different situations like that, and what have I done in the past, and what are some possibilities that they can do. So, you know, we don't want to plan in a crisis, and fortunately, if we do have to plan in a crisis, I usually already have a relationship with that department. So it's not over the past 3 years of this position, it's really have developed those relationships. So even if we are planning in a crisis, it's not as critical as it was prior to this position, because again, going back to those relationships. Notification, definitely not a replacement for planning, but it's really an enhancement to the plan. It's a part of the plan that really provides us to provide better services to that individual, because we have other people relying on us. We have those first responders relying on us. So we want to make sure that we don't want to be let down by them. We don't want to let down the individuals we serve. And if we're calling them, we certainly don't want them to let us down. So, you know, there's put some skin into the game. And, you know, it kind of forces us to make sure that we're being on top of things and planning and continually planning for that individual to meet their needs and ensure that individual's living the best life possible. Becoming that active, it all goes into becoming an active member as part of the individual's team. It really is so important and to provide that. Through some of the successes that we have seen through making the notifications and just developing these relationships is just a situational awareness that the departments have, that they can respond so much better. How should they approach the individual, speak with the individual, which all speaks to safety. Safety for the individual, safety for the provider or the family at the home, safety for the first responders that are responding, because they have that greater understanding. And when you have greater understanding, that leads to greater confidence. With greater confidence, you have consistency because you've built those skills. So you have that consistency in response. And, that's all built through that collaborative relationship. You have appropriate responses. And, I'll talk about some examples in my next slide, but you have appropriate response to what is going on. Because oftentimes these are very frustrating situations for everybody involved. So, by having information beforehand, it kind of helps to take that frustration level and just kind of bring the temperature down in the room for everyone a little bit, because everybody's playing off of this same script and the planning is not occurring in a crisis. A lot of examples. I've probably had 5 examples I could have shared with everyone just in the week back after the New Year's break. So it is just a plethora of non-ending examples. But, what we're really focused on right now is our high needs individuals. I work with our respite provider here in Cuyahoga County that we use, and they have a home in one of our communities, and they provide respite services. So the 9 out of 10 times the individuals going in there are in crisis. It's either a mental health crisis, it's either a major change and trauma that they've experienced, and so they are now in respite. So new provider, new individual, learning those experiences with that provider. And so we're really looking to meet the needs when those individuals come in, meet the needs of those individuals and the first responders, letting them know who those individuals are, letting them know there's that new individual is coming in, so that if they are called out, again, they're not surprised. So, and it's really through working through all of these situations has really developed such a great bond with that community. And they've really embraced providing those services, and assisting us with what we need to provide those individuals and keep them healthy and safe. High needs individuals moving into a new home. I do a lot of work with that with our housing and placement team, and working in conjunction. I'll do a lot of work with individuals coming out of the criminal justice system, that working with our forensic liaisons and Missy's department. So we work hand in hand to provide those supports to individuals. And again, I think it's helped us to come together and work better within our own county board to really work together and bring the departments together and to meet the needs for the individuals. I'll work in conjunction with chiefs and lieutenants, and many times I'll bring them in as part of the team for their perspective and concerns, especially when working with multi-systems individuals. And when you have a police chief and a fire chief and a lieutenant sitting at the table with the team, along with possibly the Department of Children and Family Services, maybe representation from the Adams Board as well, it's really kind of raises the sense of urgency for everybody involved. And I've found it to be very helpful in moving things along quite quickly and getting things in place for people. With our ongoing issues, because of an issue we're having with an individual that we serve, it's a 15-year-old individual, and I was able to alert the police that, because the family had alerted me that the individual had purchased a pellet gun. Well, this pellet gun, later on, the police department had sent me photos of the gun. If you place a pellet gun and a 9mm next to each other, you would not have been able to tell them apart. I was able to contact the police and let them know that the father would be contacting them and regarding some issues he was having with his son. His son had purchased a pellet gun, letting them know that when the officers did respond to the home, that there are no other weapons in the home, but there is this pellet gun there, just so that they were aware. And so that allowed those responding officers to respond to that incident with it being really a non-incident incident. They were able to secure the pellet gun away from the individual, and we moved on from there. But again, it's ensuring that health and safety, that communication. Had I not had that excellent relationship where I can pick up the phone, many times I have their cell phone numbers, not only their work cell phone numbers, but maybe a personal cell phone number that I can pick up a phone and contact is just so vitally important. And it's just been so beneficial. COVID-19 issues. Can you believe we've had issues created by COVID-19? Yes. Community members in their home, working from home, has created a lot of issues just due to the fact that people are at home and they're looking out their windows. So they're seeing all these things that are going on throughout the day that they never even have been known to occur before, because number one, everything was open. They were involved in participating in, daily activities, and then everything changed, everything shut down. So March, April, May, June, a lot of community calls as related to the community, and just, people that all of a sudden realize that there's a home with individuals that is a couple of doors down that they did not know about. And again, providing that education. Our individuals, their needs and routines being disrupted, day programs that are being either closed or hours decreased. Everybody's life has been disrupted, impacted. So including the individuals that we serve. So it's really kind of created a lot of individuals that maybe weren't having issues prior to COVID-19. We're now having some struggles like many of us are. So, that has really created that, allowed us to create that communication so we can communicate that with our communities and first responders, as well as working to resolve those issues with the teams. In the team meetings, again, participating in until that the stabilization is achieved, and still maintaining my relationship afterwards. Maybe not at once everything is in place. maybe not attending every team meeting after that, but then backing off and just popping in and checking in and see how things are going with the support administrator or provider. We get into our successes and roadblocks, and fortunately we've had many more successes than roadblocks, although in dealing with just people in general, there's always roadblocks that occur, and some we haven't experienced yet. So the greatest success and the greatest enjoyment I really get out of my position is just the strong community partners and just their care and compassion and willingness to just provide that. So, if this is something that you may think about creating in your own county board, you can't almost do it soon enough. And with everything going on with our first responders, we see that they're looking for that community policing. And so they really want to partner with us. They really look to our expertise. They look to our guidance. They are really looking to us to be that provide that assistance for them and to be their partner. The increase in awareness has just been phenomenal. And with not only our community partners, but just communities in general, with our city leaders, and again, just them knowing that they have a resource that they can reach out to, they're just so grateful for that. And going right into being that identified resource. And I think what's nice about my position is they have, again, there's no wrong door, there's no wrong phone call, but they're coming directly to me, again, reaching back to all my experience and working within our organization and knowing what each department does and what they can bring to the table, because I've reached out to them for so many years, and knowing the expertise within our organization that I can tap into as well. So get those increase in identified services and supports for individuals. Been able to recover missing persons, recovered so much quickly, especially with our individuals that elope, because we can, they already have photographs. They already are aware of the individual. They already are aware of favorite places that individual likes to go. So there's so much less time wasted as, let me try and get a photo, let me try and get you a description, and meanwhile, individual could be at risk in the community without the level of supervision required. Again, we talked about this, the increase in communication and between within our own organization, between departments, and again, just partnering within ourselves and looking to ourselves as our own resources. Building of the positive relationships in the community has just been just outstanding, and providing them with the basics about the DD system and quite frankly, the limitations of our system, because everybody feels like we're a DCFS system where we can go in and pull somebody out of their home as soon as there's an issue, or we can move a person from this home to this home, or we have a stockpile of staff just waiting to serve individuals in another home in the community if there's an issue with this home. And just, educating them on the limitations of our system and the challenges we face as well. Some of the roadblocks are dealing with so many municipalities and communities. It's just their resources. Every community is different, and every police department is different, every fire department is different, the way they're structured as far as, because their leadership, it's coming from the chief down. We're very fortunate in Cuyahoga County just to have some outstanding, talented and caring police chiefs and fire chiefs that just go above and beyond on a frequent and regular basis, even with the limited resources of their department. And, you know, I'm still trying to figure out how to get over this roadblock, but human interactions are just unpredictable. You really never know, no matter how much you think you know, you really never know what to expect and what can jump off at any given time. So again, trying to predict the future to the best of our ability. There's some individuals we do an address flag for, special attention with the police. We do all kinds of meetings, and it's never used. To me, those are successes. Those are successes. That means everybody's doing what they need to do to support that individual, and we have all those supports in place.
So continuing on with the Cuyahoga DD forensic unit, in terms of what our forensic team does, this is just breaking it down, a little bit more information kind of specifically regarding what our roles is. I know I gave a brief overview during that first section. And so again, predisposition, this is everything that is occurring prior to kind of that resolve of a case regarding the, pleas of guilty, not guilty, and then the ultimate sentencing. So again, early identification and initial booking in jail through collaborative screening. We have an excellent relationship with the jail, with MHDD courts in regards to routine notifications regarding people that get flagged. It is not only are we notified, but also a team of mental health providers, as well as those that are in recovery and treatment providers, so that we can respond if we have history, if someone's currently open and receiving our services, to kind of triage where we go from there. And so the liaisons also assist with individuals acclimating to jail. Obviously, because of COVID, we have seen quite a large decrease. But typically, when people were being booked into jail in typical world, the liaison assigned to the jail did a lot of that initial meeting with the individual, consulting with their attorney and judges, making sure that they have signed up for, if they can't afford one, for a public defendant or defense attorney, attending all their court hearings until disposition. They also collaborate with the SA and the individual's team to create the reintegration plan to facilitate release during the pretrial process. And I think it's really important to note that there are many, many people that are in jail at the pretrial level. And what that means is, at the pretrial level, they are presumed innocent. These are individuals, whether or not they have a developmental disability or not, that have not been proven guilty. And so they have not been convicted of a crime. They are simply awaiting pretrial. And so sometimes, and I'm not speaking for individuals that have committed crimes that warrant extremely high bonds. So there are people, depending on the nature of their charges, they may have no bond. They may have $1 million bond, $200,000 bond. But I think it's important to note the individuals, we see this often, that we support who are on limited income, who may just have a $300 bond. And again, they're sitting in jail. They could be sitting in jail for weeks or months. They have not been convicted. And so really the only thing that they're guilty of at that point is being poor and not having the funding to be able to bond themselves out, where many people that are listening to this right now would have the wherewithal, the resources, whether it's independently or through family, natural supports, to put up that $300 bond. And so a lot of times, if it's safe, we are advocating for a release as long as we have a good release plan. And sometimes there needs to be tweaks to the plan. Sometimes we're recognizing that the circumstances that existed that led to an arrest or a charge was directly, for example, related to supervision. And so we want to make sure we're putting our ducks in a row. We're talking with the provider, we're talking with the team, we're then sharing that information with the courts to say, We want this person to be released, and here's our new plan. Here's our updated, safer plan that we are putting into place. We also, I find that very important to mention about the pretrial process, because I think a lot of times people make the assumption that if someone's sitting in jail, you know, that they're guilty of a crime, and there's just so many individuals that, again, have not been convicted. We also work with the individuals that are out on bond. So they have posted their bond, they're out on pretrial status while their case is going through the process. So again, attending all of those court hearings, oftentimes, you know, there's ongoing adjustments that need to be made that the court is asking us to submit, whether that's what does housing look like, what is going to look like, you know, when this case is resolved. So we coordinate, in addition, all jail contact, obviously not now due to COVID, but jail contact between family, board staff, so assisting with the SAs being able to come and have contact with the individual or other team members. Oftentimes we get behavioral health involved, and you know, to come on board to do an assessment and recommendations. And so the liaison will coordinate behavioral health going into the jail to having access to start that assessment process. Also providing evaluations for inmates that trip our screening tool, again, speaking to that first linkage for eligibility, as well as MHDD court. So individuals with DD just have better outcomes when they're involved with court professionals that are specially trained working with this population. Post-disposition, so again, kind of after the resolve of the case. So if they're on probation, we attend all the probation meetings, assisting in that successful completion of the conditions of their supervision. So probation both at the municipal level as well as through felony probation. Also parole, and also addressing any barriers. So oftentimes, even best laid out plans, even if we have a great plan that's everything is spelled out in a person's ISP, we recognize that things are going to fall through the cracks. What we don't want to happen are things to fall through the cracks at no fault of the individual. So for example, if it's outlined that in the plan that this provider or this case manager, whomever is going to provide the transportation to probation, that person doesn't come, and now this person is getting violated for probation and potentially facing jail, that's where we want to come in and mitigate those barriers. Again, that's not speaking to people that are on probation that we're working with that are also continuing to engage in criminal activity, but more so when services have been outlined based on the assessed need and fall through. We want to be able to communicate and advocate that to the team. Again, we track everyone, all the individuals that are sentenced to prison, to coordinate that re-entry, usually getting back involved anywhere between 1 year to 6 months. Oftentimes we will get contacted by prison systems that have an individual they're working with that may have never been linked with us, but there is some underlying concern that they may be eligible for our services, and the liaisons will also assist with that process. We monitor all the individuals who are at Warrensville, North Coast, both those that are receiving competency restoration services, as well as those that have been deemed to be incompetent and not restorable, but are still on that court jurisdiction that I talked about before. We also work with the individuals that are on court jurisdiction that have been released into the community. We monitor all the board eligible sex offenders. Again, the importance of making sure in the planning that the registration requirements are outlined, that it's very transparent. We also, after court jurisdiction status ends, again, some people are on that status for life. Oftentimes we're working with individuals, maybe it's 8 years, maybe it's 11. When that's ended, even if they have not worked the level system and they're still at an institution, whether it be Warrensville or North Coast, once that term has ended, unless there's another order that is placed, they're going to be released in the community. So we want to get involved, again, if they've had a long-term sentence that we may not be involved the entire time, but when we're looking at a year, 9 months prior, we want to get at the table and start creating a plan because we know that they're coming home. So other things, other shared roles that we do, tons of consultation, collaboration, and education. I sound like a broken record, but I know I continue to talk about the systems that are constantly changing. Policies are constantly changing, and so we have to evolve with that. And so we're constantly providing education and collaboration internally, with our Cuyahoga teams. Here at Cuyahoga DD, as well as externally with the mental health providers, with our waiver providers. We have some fantastic providers that are very committed and dedicated to working with individuals involved with the criminal justice system. And that is huge for us to be able to successfully provide these necessary services. Also working with attorneys, doing consultation again with the MHDD court. We already talked about the eligibility screenings. We also have done some expanding work for advocacy and outreach. So not just individuals that are involved in the criminal justice system, but the court systems overall. So for example, assisting a victim of crime navigate. So not just assisting perpetrators, and obviously it would be a conflict to have the same liaison assigned to the perpetrator as well as a victim. So we would have to get two different liaisons assigned, but allowing that victim, explaining the process, advocating, at times going with them for that interview with the detective. We had a situation where one of our liaisons got linked in on a Friday. This individual was a victim of sexual assault. The meeting with the detective was going to be on Sunday. The individual and her grandmother were very, very concerned and scared about the process. And so the SA reached out to us, and the liaison assigned not only attended that initial meeting with the detective on that Sunday, again, after speaking to the individual and her grandmother with permission, but she was also able to reach out to the detective and provide some background information regarding the victim's limitations, so that detective was really able to maybe make some adjustments in terms of her interview process with how she may normally interview for someone that didn't have those types of limitations. So it really was just a win-win. We've also done some work with individuals that are involved with children's services, obtaining protection orders, evictions. So we've done some work with housing courts, as well as linking people to legal aid. So our forensic role on the team really is collaborative. Often there are times when the liaison may be the only person assigned internally through Cuyahoga County, but often there is more of a wraparound team, whether that's SA, also behavioral health, investigative agent, other ancillary services. So it's very key that the team is assessing risk, not only to the individual, but also to the community. Because at the end of the day, health and safety is a priority for all of us. And so we need to work together with that common shared goal. And so the assessment and recommendations from the team are going to determine what level of supports are needed. And as we know, it's going to look different. There is no one-fits-all strategy, as we all know the importance in this field of individualized, person-centered planning. It is exactly the same for someone that's been involved in the criminal justice system. So team members to bring to the table that we are often working with to determine what the needs and ongoing planning is. Obviously, the individual, if the individual does have a guardian, or if there are other natural supports identified by that person that they want at the table as an advocate or to provide information. A lot of times the individual, there's certain team members that have to be at the table, for example, the SA or the liaison maybe, or the IA. And so offering that to them, who else do you want to be here at the table for your support? We also have behavioral health. So if your county offers behavioral health or has that behavioral health department, so we often, almost, I would say 99% of the time, if we're looking at planning for an individual involved in the criminal justice system, whether that's released from jail, prison, they're experiencing probation violations, oftentimes we have behavioral health doing their assessment and recommendations to the team really based on risk and mitigating that risk. We'll have the mental health provider or any treatment team. So if someone is getting substance use treatment, sex offender treatment, we would want them at the table for planning. The court official, so what are the terms of probation or parole, making sure that's outlined and addressed. The residential and vocational provider, clearly we want there, as well as at times, there's consultation with our in-house attorney, things that we need to run by them. So as I said, individualized and person-centered planning is really essential. All offenders are not alike, just like all individuals that we work with are not alike. And so we really need to base, for planning purposes, the spectrum of services is really going to be based on assessments and team collaboration. And I like this spectrum because for me, it helps visually see, the two far ends of the spectrum and then everything that's in between. So on one end of this spectrum, we have, and I'll go into more detail about this and give examples, but we have a person who has a developmental disability who also happens to commit a crime, okay? And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a person who has a criminal mindset who happens to have a developmental disability. And then we have everything in between. And so and we know that the support needs are going to be different depending on where that person lands on the spectrum based on their own individual needs and limitations. So for example, persons who have a developmental disability who happen to commit a crime. So a lot of times, these are individuals whose involvement in the criminal justice system is largely attributed to their developmental disability or their mental health symptomology and their impaired ability to understand consequences. So we are talking about individuals that have potentially moderate intellectual, severe intellectual disabilities that compromises their judgment, their insight, their impulse control. We know that mental health, especially significant mental health diagnoses, such as, if they have psychosis or schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar, may even further impact their deficits, especially if they're not linked with services. They may be easily manipulated or exploited. They have many day-to-day needs for ADLs, as well as, like I said, mental health impairments. So the increased degree of impairment equates to that increased system responsibility and support. So these are the individuals. A great example are the individuals on ISTU CJ status. So those that have committed very serious crimes, who are not competent and not restorable, but are eligible in receiving services through our DD board. On the other end of that spectrum are persons who have more of a criminal mindset, who happen to have a developmental disability. So we are talking about individuals whose involvement in the criminal justice system is most likely not attributed to their developmental disability or their mental health symptomology. And there is evidence of deliberate or purposeful acts. And again, this is all information that we're going to know through the assessment process, as well as our relationship and knowledge of this person. Oftentimes, these are individuals that have a mild range of ID or no ID at all. And they're receiving our services because they have a diagnosis of ADHD, maybe they have Tourette's. Oftentimes, these individuals have no severe mental illness. There's no evidence of dual diagnosis. They often have pretty excellent or higher level adaptive skills. They can navigate the community. They may be competitively employed. Oftentimes, they're too high functioning for a guardian. They may have refused services in the past and are not compliant. And so these are more individuals that we're talking about that have more criminogenic traits. And so they have a history of poor decision-making, again, purposeful behavior. I know this can be difficult to tease out, and my intention is not to oversimplify it, but I think for the purposes of looking at this on a spectrum, it serves the purpose. And so the decreased level of impairment also equates to decreased supports. So just because someone is receiving our services and has a developmental disability, that does not mean that it is our role to act and as policing them. So we are not simply going to recommend 24/7 supports solely for the purpose of preventing them from making a bad decision if they don't have that assessed need. And so I think that that's important to note. Again, the supports that are in place that are going to be recommended are going to be based on the assessed need. So again, it's a spectrum, and the team goal is to promote safety and success for individuals, as well as we want the community to be safe. And so the assessment process is going to really, one of the biggest things that we need to look at is what is the risk? What is the risk to the individual? What is the risk to the community? Most of the individuals that we're working with, if they're involved in the criminal justice system, automatically they're going to most likely have the risk of further legal sanction, right? If they've already been convicted, if they're actively on parole or on probation, they're a registered sex offender, those individuals are at risk of further legal sanction if they don't follow the legal requirements that are outlined in their supervision. Ideally, this assessment is completed by a trained professional we're looking at, I like to frame this as the language that we use. So we're not just looking at how do we best support this criminal, right? It's how do we best support this person who committed a crime, who has a history of committing a crime. That's just one part of who this person is and one part of their history. And so we really need to look at all the protective factors. What is the level of supervision that's going to be needed? Treatment needs, service needs, and looking at the bigger picture, considering that legal history is again, one piece of this person's history. And so we also want to look at the factors that are destabilizing for the individual. What are the protective or stabilizing factors? What are their support needs for ADLs? Taking into account their cognitive level and their impairments, and as well as their mental health diagnoses. And so without thorough assessments, there's an increased risk of individuals living in a more restrictive setting. So for example, that kind of one size fits all, you've been convicted of a crime, and so we're going to put you in a setting where you're supervised 24/7, or being released without needed supports and increasing the risk of recidivism or really unsafe things happening for the individual or the community. So I think an example of that is an individual who may have been very actively wrapped in services, gets sentenced to prison or 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, and without that linkage of reintegrating them back to services and supports, we are at great risk of them being released without anything that they may need to be successful. So here we really want to maximize the community integration, but also, of course, it's important to minimize the health and safety. So we're going to talk about some in practice examples. So this is an example of someone who would have an assessed high need of support. And so this is an example of someone that's on that far end of the spectrum. So John is 24 years old. He has a moderate intellectual disability. He also has ADHD and a diagnosis of bipolar. He has a complex trauma history and no natural supports. This reminds me of so many cases that we see of kids that are in custody of children's services that are at that transition age. And they're coming into our system now, 18, 19, 20, 21, and we begin the planning and we see that there are just so many obstacles and so many barriers and so many support needs for this really young kiddo or young adult as they're transitioning out. So for John, he has charges of burglary and aggravated theft. He has a juvenile criminal history where he has been found incompetent. He was on ISTU CJ, or he is on ISTU CJ, so again, incompetent, unrestorable, court jurisdiction for 8 years. He was at Warrensville and successfully completed the level system. And so he was granted level 5 conditional release out into the community. And so here's the information that we have in a snapshot. More importantly, what does the team now say about what the assessed needs are based on all of that information gathering? And so what has been determined in John's case is that he really, the assessed needs is 24/7 supervision and support in a congregate setting. And the reason for that is because the assessments have indicated that John stabilizes in that structured and supportive setting. He responds well to that constant redirection and staff support, and also requires a lot of assistance with his ADLs. He needs help with meal prep, shopping, coordinating all of his appointments, medication administration. He's going to need ongoing support with conditional release. Without having a team around him, John would not be able to successfully navigate these requirements independently, given his limitations. He also needs a supportive vocational program. He needs ongoing psychiatric services, as well as benefits from the forensic monitoring to report to court any issues or any problem solving around any barriers. And so a lot of times this type of example, oftentimes are individuals that are on ISTU CJ status. Looks similarly, again, everything has to be individualized, but looks similarly to a situation like this. So on the other end of the spectrum, this is an example of someone that, based on the assessed need, minimal supports have been identified. So this is Michael. He's 34 years old. He has a diagnosis of ADHD and has a borderline intellectual disability. He has charges of assault. He has a criminal history also of assault and OVI. He was just released from jail and he's going to be on probation for 3 years. There's also a protection order in place for the victim in the assault case. He does live with a roommate independently. And he also recently lost his job due to his incarceration. So the assessed need, again, based on the snapshot of Michael and after further digging and information gathering by all those team members, it was decided that community supports and linkage is enough. So linkage for alcohol and drug treatment, therapy, transportation, and employment. So the assessment indicates that Michael responds well to those external controls in place where there are clear expectations and also routine oversight. And so again, for Michael, we're not going to remove him from his independent living with a roommate and say, you are now going to be in a congregate setting and receive 24/7 supports because we cannot let you violate the terms of your probation, right? We want to highlight his independence. We would never want to take that away, but we just need to build around just some smaller supports that make sense based on his needs. So what we've done in this case is we have requested that his involvement with his DD team is a term of his probation, and that probation requirements are very clearly outlined in his ISP and very transparent, so everyone is aware of what the expectations are. Because Michael benefits from those external controls in place, he's going to have regular check-ins with his SA as well as his forensic liaison assigned. Forensics is also going to attend the weekly probation appointments and the monthly staffings with the team. And the forensic liaison is going to act as a direct link to the probation officer regarding any barriers to services or probation, as well as any TPO violations. Again, here our role is not necessarily to prevent Michael from violating the TPO or from, driving under the influence or not attending probation, but it's based on where we saw the need was. Re-entry barriers. I don't think this is going to be probably new news to the majority of people that when people are released from jail or prison, regardless if they have DD, they experience many obstacles when transitioning back into the community, especially if they have been incarcerated for a significant amount of time. And our individuals with DD just often face even more. So the more proactive that we can be as a team prior to the release to mitigate and address the known barriers and identify those needed supports, the better. And so housing is just such a barrier for so many. I think this is something throughout the state of Ohio. If your county's not experiencing issues with housing, let us know how you're doing it because we could learn. It is so difficult and it's becoming increasingly difficult. And so some questions we want to be asking from the individual and from the team when this person's getting ready to be released is, what was housing prior to this incarceration? Is that an option, or are there now new barriers? For example, does the victim live there? Does the co-defendant in the case live at the previous residence? Are there access to children at the previous home? And now this person's been convicted isn't able to have contact with children due to the crimes being sexual in nature. Or there's also those cases of individuals where they may have lived with family, and none of those things exist. So it would be okay if they returned back to their prior living arrangement. However, we know historically it has been unsuccessful. Maybe they've lived with mom and dad, and there has been barriers with mom and dad assisting with following up with mental health services or with communicating with the DD board, or they've just continued to accrue more and more criminal charges. And so sometimes as a team, we come together and say, you know what, that hasn't worked. So let's start with a new plan and go from there. So whether that's, again, I'm not suggesting a congregate setting, but maybe it's time, this individual is 25. Maybe it's time we explore them living on their own or with a roommate or a congregate setting, potentially, where, based on what the need is. Other areas that are huge barriers are oftentimes our individuals may not have any natural supports upon their release. If they do, we want to know who they are so we can reach out to them, make sure that connection is happening upon this transition. Employment, huge barrier, especially if you have a criminal history. And so we want to, kind of know that up front in terms of, how do we problem solve from there? Access to services. What are the identified services and how do we link that person prior to them getting out? Who can we bring to the table? Who can we go visit this person in jail, in prison? There's been times where we've got a car full of DD team members, going to visit an individual. I was part of one of those teams. He's being released after 13 years in prison. And so it's myself, it's the housing. At that time, I was acting as a behavioral health specialist, but it was myself, it was the forensic liaison, it was the housing and assessment essay, and we're all going together because we need to get as much information that we possibly can so we can create a plan that's going to best support this individual, their safety, and the community's safety. So even smaller things that sometimes may be off our radar, establishing insurance. A lot of times people don't have insurance when they're getting out. They have to reinstate their food stamps, their Social Security. Medically, when's the last time they've been to the doctor? Have they ever had a PCP? Follow up for their medical appointments. A lot of times people don't even have a state ID. So that's going to be a barrier then to getting SSI or to getting food stamps or Medicaid. And really triaging all of these additional barriers that our individuals may face. Payee, how do they manage their funds when they're getting out? Do we need to have a payee in place early on? Who's going to be managing that? Or can they successfully manage that on their own? Does the individual understand the terms of their probation and parole? Okay, so in terms of service planning and ISP development, so what does all of this mean? And I'm breaking it down into, the services and linkage that are going to be important to connect, and then what can possibly go into an ISP. And I want to start with saying there's a difference between what we consider, for me, a difference between non-compliance versus barriers that are existing because of someone's disability or mental health symptomology. There are absolutely those individuals that are non-compliant that tell us they don't want our services, which are voluntary, unless they're court ordered through probation or parole. And we respect that, and we're not going to force ourselves. If someone truly doesn't want our services, we understand that. Compared to what may look like non-compliance. So the example I gave before, someone missing probation, someone missing registration. However, if we dive a little bit deeper and we see, actually, this person is not capable, truly not capable of doing these things without supports, we need to reframe that. Is that non-compliance, or is that, no, that's a barrier that we need to make sure is addressed in the plan. And so in terms of looking at services and linkage, and this is going to vary from person to person, oftentimes, our teams are looking at what are the housing options. Who's going to be the HPC and residential provider if it's been determined that one is needed and this person is on a waiver, or going to be subsidized temporarily until the waiver goes through. The process of roommate matching. So getting teams together to say, hey, I'm working with so-and-so, here's some kind of general information. I know you're working with so-and-so. Do we think this might be a good match? A lot of times we're in a position where roommate matching is needed because of the fact that people have such limited finances. And so living independently, when they're solely supported on SSI, the options for housing are quite bleak. I'm just going to be honest. We're looking at one-bedroom efficiencies that may not be in a good part of town if they have criminal history. We need to look at kind of the demographics that are in these areas. And so a lot of times we're matching roommates together. MUI Community Liaison, we love working with Dave. He helps us tremendously in terms of making that necessary contact with the community. Because again, people are going to be released. And so they're coming back into the community. And so Dave just is an excellent resource for us to provide that necessary education. Exploring employment. So based on the person's limits, are they appropriate for, an adult day service? Again, someone that's coming out of Warrensville or North Coast that might be on court jurisdiction. They may have such limitations that an ADS is appropriate. So moving forward with that. Or, a vocational provider exploring OOD, looking at, again, mental health, alcohol and drug, if they're ordered for sex offender treatment, which I know is very hard to find, especially even in Cuyahoga County, where we really are quite rich in resources. It is very difficult to obtain. What's the support from family, from peers, and from the community? So what's going to go into the ISP? So again, from those assessments, it's really going to drive the team input, and the team meaning the collaborative team, outlining what is that identified risk. Is the risk related to supervision? Is the risk related to elopement? Is the risk related to having unsupervised access with children? There's so many different areas that could go, but it's really important that it's clearly outlined. What are the triggers? What are the environmental factors that we want to make sure the team knows so that we can hopefully mitigate that? For example, there's many individuals that we work with that if they are not taking their medications, we are going to see some significant decompensation, and there's a high likelihood that the police are going to be responding, or they're going to be back in the hospital. And so we want to make sure that all the steps are in place and that communication is clear if for some reason medication stops. Another example would be having access to children. I worked with an individual who was being released from prison after his second sexual offense against children. He had been in prison the last time for 13 years. And in both cases, when examining the circumstances regarding his offense, in both circumstances, it was opportunity. He was given unlimited access to a child for babysitting purposes, despite the fact that it was clearly outlined that that should not happen. And so we wanted to make sure that it was extremely transparent and clear that this person was getting out of prison, and at no time was there to be any unsupervised contact with any child at any point. And so, he's been released for a few years now, and he, knock on wood, has been doing really well. Again, it's about following the plans that are in place. So safety planning. What is a provider to do if a person is starting to escalate? We want providers to be prepared. We want providers to be trained. When they see A, how should they respond? Elopement is another one. If John is deciding that he's frustrated, he's walking off, but John is someone that outlined his plan, gets 24/7 visual supervision because of the risk he poses, and he leaves and the provider's no longer able to provide visual supervision, what next? And so again, there's a plan in place and it's very clear for the provider and they feel supported. What are the requirements of their supervision? Roles of the team, who's responsible? So if a person does truly need assistance with attending probation, who's going to do that? And again, needing assistance because of their limitations, not because Joe says, give me a ride, and is going to use the provider as a taxi when we know John is fully capable of accessing public transportation. Documentation. So what is that going to look like? Is the team going to come together on a quarterly basis, on a weekly basis? When things start to bubble up, how are we going to communicate that to the team so that we're proactive? So team ISP discussion, so that there's clearly defined supervision levels at home, work, and community. I have found that this is so important. There have been many, many times where a lapse in the defined supervision level in the plan, or maybe the supervision level just wasn't clear in the plan to begin with, directly correlated with involvement in the criminal justice system. Dave and I had a really big one that kind of exploded last week, and not to go into too much detail, but it couldn't have been more clear in the plan. The specifics of this person's elopement, who has moderate to severe intellectual disability, and that was not followed, and now we're dealing with some serious court involvement. Again, that won't apply to everyone. There are some individuals working with us that don't have any staff, in the home. They don't have a waiver, and we're simply providing more of that community support. Looking at rights restrictions versus court requirements. So the difference between making a recommendation of lock sharps because this person has attempted to be very aggressive and to go after roommates with weapons, or has a history of suicidal ideation. And so to mitigate that risk, and we have the documentation to support it, we want those sharps to be locked versus a probation court requirement of random drug screens, or they need to report, quarterly, or they have this documentation that needs to be submitted to probation, not rights restrictions. Questions of guardianship. Although I know even if the team determines guardianship is the best next step, we all know that guardians are not just lining up saying, hey, I want to be a volunteer guardian for a really challenging, difficult situation that you have. So again, identifying the need is one thing, but determining the follow-up best next step is going to be tricky at times. Provider training. Again, we have some phenomenal providers that we were lucky to work with here in Cuyahoga County that are very invested and committed, have a lot of experience working with individuals involved in the criminal justice system, which these individuals sometimes are some of the most complex and challenging, and I think, as Dave mentioned, frustrating. And so it's not easy. What does communication look like? We want to make sure that that is really outlined. It's essential that the individual knows the role of the team members and who to contact. Oftentimes in these circumstances, we've got really big teams. I mean, there's times we go to Zoom and there are 12 of us, right? There's the PO, there's the individual, there's the guardian, there's me, there's Dave, there's the liaison, there's behavioral health, and the individual is overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed. I'm trying to figure out who's doing what. And so oftentimes in these situations, something will start bubbling at home. The individual doesn't know who to contact, so contacts everyone on the team, maybe reporting different things to each person. So now we have 100 emails about Joe said this, what are we going to do about that or this? And it's just complete chaos. So in order to mitigate that, if we can clearly outline to the best of our abilities who to contact and for what, oftentimes the individuals we support benefit from having that listed out, or the use of visuals or reminder cards. So they know this is this person's role, this is what you call them for, and this is this person's role. So I'm working with someone that's involved in the criminal justice system right now. What is my role? So let's say you're in a county that not a forensic unit, there may not be SAs that work with individuals involved in the criminal justice system. It may not be something that's occurring very often in the county that you work with. I mean, every county is different. So where do you go from here? And kind of quick and dirty recommendations would be, one, to obtain a release of information from the individual and include everyone that you can. Again, if the individual is willing. Your role would be to help in this process, but the individual has the right to say no, but including your agency, who is the current team and any providers, who's the court personnel, there's a probation officer, there's a public defender assigned, there's a jail liaison. So this allows that immediate sharing of information with the courts and the current team. This will also allow you to learn the status of the case. You can also provide pertinent information based on the individual's needs. And we just have so many examples, and for the sake of time, I'm going to quickly go through all this and not give examples, and I apologize about that. But a lot of times we are sharing information with teams that they had no idea. So we're contacting, the attorneys and saying, listen, let me tell you this, and this about this individual. And they're going, oh my goodness, this is so important. We need to know this. I will now share this, with jail staff. If the person is incarcerated, contacting the jail to coordinate. Is there an advocate there? Is there a liaison? Does the individual have what they need? Do they have medications? Does the jail even know that they were taking medications? Is there an interpreter, or if English is not their first language, or they have mobility or vision issues? Do they understand the charges and the process? So really gathering all of that information. So where do we go from here? We have given tons of information. And so these are some questions really to ask at each of your agencies where you're coming from. We all know that every county is different. We all have unique demographics, access to resources, unique gaps in services or different barriers. And so this is going to look different for every county. And so just some questions are to ask, kind of internally to get this process started, and kind of the conversation beginning is, what are our current practices in supporting individuals involved in the criminal justice system? Some agencies may have some very well-developed practices. Some may have none. This may be a huge gap where it has not been on the radar, depending on, the services that are in place. How many individuals do we currently serve that are involved? Do we have a baseline? We need to start collecting data. Where are we talking about 5 people? Are we talking about 500 people? What are our current relationships and communication with the courts, with the police, with parole and with probation? Do we have any relationships at all with them? What are our current barriers? Do we have a specialized docket? Again, some counties do, some counties don't, but knowing is really important if you do or not. If we do, what's the screening and eligibility procedures? Are we involved at all in that process, from a DD board? Do we already collaborate with the criminal justice system or other community providers? And what does that look like? Do we have CIT trained law enforcement? This is an area where we could have, again, done probably a full day training on, but officers that are trained in crisis intervention. And so do we have them, and who are they, and can we reach out to them to partner? Are our jails currently using a validated screening tool? Do we currently have providers that are interested in working with this population? Maybe we have providers that already are, but maybe we have providers that would be really interested. Could we continue to get an increase in providers that newer providers that show interest in this population? Is there anyone currently completing risk assessments to the individuals we support? If not, who can in our community? How can we build upon our existing services? Can we explore or expand our current partnerships? Do we have a platform that already exists to share information with cross-system partners? So, in terms of where we go from here, just like Cuyahoga did 40 plus years ago back in 1980, when they recognized, number one, that there was a need. They recognized that individuals with DD were frequently getting involved at the felony level with charges at a rate that they had not seen before. And they recognized there was a gap in that service. And so if you don't have any services in place at your county now, or your role or position at your agency, my advice is step one is just to start small, just like we did. Create an internal focus group to evaluate what are our current practices, what are our barriers, what are our gaps in services. Again, this will be different from county to county. You can use the template of questions to ask. Add to that template of questions to ask. There was something that was missed or something that's very unique and particular to your county, really as a foundation or a base. Include interdisciplinary departments if you have them at your county. So whether that's MUI, behavioral health, if you have a provider support team, making sure that you're getting kind of different frameworks and different ideas at the table about where those gaps are. Collect data. Again, the difference between, are we talking about 5 individuals or are we talking about 500? Review the current job descriptions. Is there a current position in place at your agency that is a good fit to kind of start building on this role? So number 2, exploring and assessing existing services and agencies then within your community. So still at an internal level, kind of looking at who are our current providers. That's going to vary county to county, depending on the size. So who do we go to for mental health? Who do we go to for alcohol and drug crisis services, housing? In Cuyahoga County, we are very lucky that, many individuals have the option of a variety of mental health providers to go to. We're very rich in that sense. There are counties that maybe have one, and maybe that one mental health provider is 30 minutes away. And now we have to look at transportation. But let's at least gather the information to build upon it so we know what does exist. Are there jail liaisons? Kind of who's doing what? Maybe mental health is already in the jail. Maybe there's already crisis services that have established protocol with the jail that we're unaware of. And where do we go to partner with them? So 3, bringing others to the table. So now that we've collected our data, we've done a really good, not only internal at our level of agency, but we've explored what's out there in the community. Now it's time to get what's going to be our engagement strategy. How do we get collaboration within the community and with our stakeholders? What's going to be the buy-in? How do we expand on the current established relationships and really developing a needs assessment with the community partnerships? And lastly, training and education. So the importance of the awareness of recognizing what the gaps are in services for the individuals involved in the criminal justice system, and truly the negative impact that it has in the community. Again, going back to the beginning about especially just very significant for some of the individuals that we work with based on a variety of risk and variables, but are they coming out incarcerated better neighbors, better community members, or are they coming out worse? And are there alternatives to incarceration in certain circumstances that make sense? and also identifying the benefits. This is about health and safety for all of us. This is about mitigating risk. And this is financially profitable for us as taxpayers because it costs a whole lot of money for someone to be in jail, to be in prison. If recidivism is high and they're going back, that is all costly for the community. Possible stakeholders, I'm not going to go through this, but and it will, again, will depend. There's people I'm sure I didn't include on here that you have in your community, but just to give you some ideas, one that's not included but is extremely valuable is getting the voice of individuals and their families that have been impacted by their involvement in the criminal justice system. What are their stories? What are their experiences? What are their ideas about where that can grow and where partnering can take place? So that is one that I mistakenly did not put on here, and that was an error. It's also important that the stakeholders really represent, there's cross-system representation. So what does collaboration look like? Again, active engagement and commitment. We want the buy-in, we want people engaged in this process, that there's very clear expectations, that there's goal setting and very clear objectives. We're not just all sitting at the table going, yeah, this is a really bad problem, but we kind of have no direction, right? That's not going to be an efficient use of anyone's time. So identifying through this process, what are our top priorities? Where do we start? It has to start somewhere. Again, Cuyahoga County, this was 40 plus years in the making and continues to evolve. So what are our top priorities based on our data collection, what we've gotten from our stakeholders, our collaborative efforts? Again, this is going to be different from county to county. Information sharing. Do we have a platform that exists? We all want to make sure we're communicating the most accurate, up-to-date information so that we can continue to problem solve and identify once we've met one goal, let's go to number two. Also cross-training. You know, I can talk about involvement with DD and in the criminal justice system, but I'm not an expert in substance use treatment. And so being able to provide that cross-training between collaborative departments is also really important. Not all counties are the same. This is redundant. We know demographics are different, available resources are different. We know that there are barriers. What we do have in common is every single county has a board of DD. All 88 of our counties have a board of DD. All 88 of our counties either have or contract with the police, with court systems, and with emergency services. And so that is where we start. So coming full circle, the goal is providing services and supports for individuals involved in the criminal justice system to help promote health and safety for the individual as well as the community as a whole. Just better outcomes for all of us. And so just kind of a quick overview of what we talked about today, that individuals with DD are overrepresented in all areas of the CJS. They're also at increased risk of victimization, both in and outside of being incarcerated. They often face increased barriers navigating the criminal justice system while incarcerated. And within Cuyahoga County, our specialized dockets, our forensic unit, our MUI Community Liaison assist our internal team and external community providers with advocacy, linkage, support, and education. Again, do we want people better or do we want them worse? And all their alternatives. Assessments are essential to identifying support needs, risk mitigating factors, and ISPs reflect those supports and services to mitigate that identified risk and outline the roles. I've included a bunch of resources here. I'm not going to go through them because we are like out of time almost, but just to highlight Ohio trial courts, this is where you can find, if your county has anything web-based, where you can look up cases and find out if you have a specialized court. The DRC, number two, where you can look up and see if an individual you serve is currently incarcerated in the prison system in Ohio, or if they're actively on parole. And then the rest are just a variety of other resources, questions, concerns. My information is on here. Dave's information is on here. Thank you all so much. This is something that I think Dave and I both are extremely passionate about, and I hope that there is at least for some of you a takeaway here and that there was some good information. So thank you on behalf of ourselves, our Behavioral Health Department, our liaisons, MUI, and Cuyahoga DD as a whole. Thank you for being here.